The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is part 3 of 3. So today we're wrapping up our 3-part series on improving safety for bicyclists. This is all based on the course Designing for Bicyclist Safety. The webinar series we've been doing is based on that course. It's a new training course that was developed by the Federal Highway Administration, VHB, and Tool Design Group. And it's really intended to cover sort of the basics, the fundamentals of really the principles of how we design streets and intersections to improve safety for bicyclists. Designing streets that work for everyone, especially bicyclists, and really focusing on that user group. So we're glad you're here today. This is part 3. So last week what we did was we addressed the topic of bicycle facilities along the road. Our panelists really dove into and explored options for facilities ranging from shared lanes all the way up to separated bike lanes, and really talked about when different types of designs are most appropriate. And so today what we're going to do is take a dive into a topic that many agencies are struggling with. How do we improve safety and comfort for bicyclists at intersections? So our panelists will explore options for signal strategies, intersection geometry, and other solutions that are intended to address crossing locations. This webinar series is being supported by the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety through a program that provides training and technical assistance to the FHWA designated pedestrian and bicyclist focus cities and states. My name is Dan Jeline. I work here at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, and I will be facilitating the webinar today. And I'd like to introduce you to each of our panelists. First, we're going to be hearing from Brooke Struve. She is a safety and geometric design engineer with the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Office. Brooke led the development of the Designing for Bicyclist Safety training course with assistance from VHB and Tool Design Group and others at FHWA. And she has been leading this training in cities around the country. And joining Brooke today is Greg Bakos. He's a principal within the Transportation Engineering Services Group at VHB. Greg manages projects in northern New England and serves as a member of VHB's Bike and Pedestrian Design and Healthy Community Design groups. He specializes in complete streets and bicycle and pedestrian design. Brooke and Greg together have a wealth of knowledge and experience in the area of bicycle safety design. We're really lucky to have them joining us here today. Before we get into things, I wanted to go through just a few housekeeping items today. First, I wanted to ask attendees, if you can hear us, please raise your hand by clicking the button located in the upper left-hand corner of your screen to let us know that you can hear us and that we're coming in loud and clear. Okay, great. I can see those hands going up. I appreciate your feedback. Glad you can hear us. We're glad you're here today. I just wanted to let everybody know that if for whatever reason your computer freezes during the session, you should be able to just reload the website, log back in, and rejoin the session that way. Note that you won't have the ability to speak during the webinar. You do have the ability to submit questions and comments to us using the chat function. So I hope you'll be able to locate that. Send us comments, send us questions as we go along. We are going to be holding about 25 to 30 minutes for a discussion session at the end of the presentations with our panelists. So we'll be holding most of the questions for that time. We are going to be posting, actually already have posted, a copy of the presentation slides from today's webinar. I think there were a few modifications to the slides, so I'm going to be posting an updated version too. But for now, you can find that at our website, pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. It's already posted there. We are going to be recording the session and posting that video, hopefully later today. If not, that'll be up tomorrow morning. The website also has links to other resources and other materials that you might find to be helpful. Later today, you're going to be receiving a follow-up email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. That email is going to include a couple of things. One, a link that you can use to download your certificate of attendance for this webinar. So it's important that if you're attending with other people in the room, that you pass that email around to them so that they can also get that certificate of attendance. The email is also going to contain a link where you can access the archives from the webinar today. So the slide presentation, the video, the same link is actually going to take you to the archive for parts 1 and parts 2 of the series as well. So if this is your first time joining us, we're glad you're here. We hope you'll go back and maybe rewatch episodes 1 and 2 to get a refresher on some of those issues that we discussed then. You can visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars for information about all the upcoming webinars that we have. I'll share some of those in just a moment. You can keep up to date with us on social media. So on Facebook and Twitter, we're at pedbikeinfo. We are actually going to be tweeting a little bit about the webinar today using hashtag PBACwebinar if you're interested in joining us for that. And then you can also stay up to date with us just by signing up for our mailing list. We're going to be doing a bunch of webinars over the next few months. 2 are coming up in May, actually, and I wanted to let you know about them. These are kind of right up your alley if you're into bike networks and multimodal networks. So we're going to be doing one on May 10th about how to incorporate bicycle networks into your resurfacing projects and taking advantage of those opportunities to get things implemented. So take a look at that one. That's May 10th. And then we're going to be doing one on May 17th all about how we measure multimodal network connectivity and how we can use maps to really visualize our existing networks and how we see the future networks and what we want to propose and build those out. So 2 really important sessions, all happening in Bike Month. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for those. Over the next few months, we're going to be doing other sessions on things like truck side guards and their ability to reduce bicycle fatalities and serious injuries. And we're going to be doing a 2-part series later this summer all about autonomous vehicle technology and how those may impact bicycle and pedestrian safety. So a bunch of sessions coming up that you might want to keep on your radar. I'll finish up with that, and the only other thing I have on my list to do before we get into the presentations today is take a poll, and we just want to find out about how many people are out there today. So if you can take a moment and let us know if it's just you attending from your site, if you have 2 or 3 people with you, 4 or 5, or maybe a larger group. We just want to get a better handle on how people are attending the webinars and how many people are out there. So I'm going to leave this open for about 10 more seconds, and then we'll switch right over to Brooke and Greg and get rolling with our presentations today. Just a few more seconds on the poll, and then we're going to go ahead and close that down and move along. Okay. Really appreciate everybody voting in that for us. We appreciate your feedback. I'm gonna close it down now. Thanks for that information. Brooke, you should see the screen coming your way, and accept that whenever you're ready.
All right, you should be seeing my screen now. Does that look all right?
I do. Go right ahead.
Okay. So as Dan mentioned, this is the 3rd part in our webinar series. And I'm Brooke Struve, and with me is Greg. Greg, why don't you say hello?
Hi, everybody.
Just a reminder, in the previous webinars, we talked about some of the key safety factors that contribute to or detract from bicyclist safety and comfort. And a lot of the countermeasures we're going to be talking about today will be referring or be in a direct response to trying to address one of those. Another reminder, as we've said previously, things are changing quickly in terms of what the best practices and guidelines are for designing for bicyclists. And so there may be some images that you see in this presentation today that might be showing some outdated treatments. Additionally, I would say any guidance that you're looking at currently might be current now, but it might not be current very much longer. So always double check to make sure you've got the latest and greatest information. One of the tools that we have available to us is on our FHWA website, where we talk specifically about some of the traffic control devices specific for bicyclists and which are under experimentation or interim approval, and some additional information on interpretations. I'll also mention that our MUTCD team has some excellent Q&As available on Chapter 9 of the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. So with that, let's just review some of those intersection design principles that improve safety for everyone. Remember, intersections are sort of a designed conflict area, and so some of the things that we can do to improve safety is reduce speed, minimize the exposure to the conflict points, make sure that we're communicating right-of-way priority, and providing adequate sight distance. So we'll first talk about shared use path crossings. This is a scenario where you might have a shared use path that's following alongside a busier highway, and then you have some side streets that are coming into that shared use path. Some of the things you can certainly do are enhancing that shared use path crossing so it's much more visible and is encouraging those slower speeds. But one thing to remember is some of the risks associated with the turning movement from the major street. One in particular that's especially bad is a left turn from the major street turning onto the side street. If you have a bicyclist traveling in the same direction as that left turning vehicle, they're going to be in the blind spot of the driver or behind and to the left of the driver, and that driver is going to be very focused on looking for gaps in traffic and may not be as aware of the bicyclist. And if that left turning vehicle is, or if that street has a very high speed, the bicyclist who's looking for an opportunity to cross may not even be aware that that vehicle that's approaching is going to choose to make a left turn. They may not have turned on their left signal yet, and at higher speeds, all of those things could be happening before the bicyclist fully crosses the side street. And so that's why you see some suggested offsets that are related to speed, giving a little more time and space for the turning vehicle to make the maneuver and see the bicyclist or pedestrian crossing the path. And at lower speeds, you maybe don't need as much of an offset because there's more forgiveness, more time to respond and react. We find that having that offset puts them in a much more visible location instead of having the crossing right adjacent to the roadway.
It actually, Brooke, gives them a little refuge because that left turning vehicle is going to commit to a turn, and once they've committed, that's it. They have to take that position onto the side street, and if there's that wide enough gap, that dimension A there, they can actually hang out there and not cross the crosswalk or be struck by the oncoming vehicle.
Exactly.
Hey, Brooke, this is Dan. Just curious if you can share where this diagram is coming from, a couple of questions on that.
This came from a just released document by FHWA, and I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's the Small Towns and Rural Road Networks.
Yep,
and
I'll put the link out to everybody on that. I've got it right here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, that came out just this year. There's a lot of great information that you could also use in urban centers as well. So in terms of when we're looking at a shared use path and crossing mid-block, there's sort of a methodology or a process that you want to go through when you're designing it. You're first probably going to be laying out your geometry, looking at the terrain and so forth, and then looking at and making some decisions about the roadway characteristics related to lanes, speeds, volumes. And based on that information, you've got to think about what your site triangles are. And then you get to decide where are you going to put the priority in terms of right-of-way through the crossing. And then determining what treatments are appropriate based on all of those choices. And then going back through the loop again to see if you need to tweak or refine any of those decisions that you made previously. So in terms of site triangles, we're dealing with two vehicles, or a bicycle and a motor car, approaching the crossing, and we want to think about the speeds that they're approaching. Your typical bicyclist is going to be potentially in the 10 to 12 mile an hour range, which is certainly different than a pedestrian who is going to be walking at about 4 feet per second. And so that dimension B is going to be different for a bicyclist than you would consider for a pedestrian. And then also thinking about the approaching speed for the motor vehicle and providing enough clear sight lines so that people can make the appropriate decisions. And you have the same condition for the other side of the crossing as well, with a similar site triangle. This is one way that you could approach signing and marking for a crossing. In this situation, the path is yielding to the roadway, and so we have yield signs and warning signs on the pathway as it approaches the roadway. And we also have some warning signs along the roadway to alert motor vehicles that, maybe someone crossing the path won't be making the best choices and give them a heightened awareness so that they can yield if necessary. Greg, do you want to talk about the choice between making this a stop control on the pathway versus the yield control?
Yes, certainly. I think this is an important decision. We've seen many municipalities make the decision to put a stop sign here. And you make that choice based on your sight triangles, really, and is there enough distance for the cyclist to see and be seen by the people on the roadway, and if there is, then consider making it a yield instead of a stop. What we've seen, especially on very busy paths, is that there's a high degree of cyclists not really obeying the stop sign. They will treat it like a rolling stop, and they will essentially treat it more like a yield, especially if they do have good sight lines. And if it is a busy trail or path, there's actually a social thing going on where you feel pressure not to stop because there's people behind you who are going to maybe bark at you if you do stop. So we've seen a lot of that where towns then reconsider, well, should they just make it a yield instead? But back to the basics, though, you do need the sight lines. This is all covered in the AASHTO Bike and Pedestrian Design Guide, and section 5.3.2 covers the sight lines and the different considerations for geometrics.
Now the other option is, flipping who has priority, asking the motorist to yield or stop on the approach to the crossing, and letting the pedestrians and bicyclists have free movement across the crossing. Here again, I think sight triangles are important, making sure that you've got visibility to make some good choices in the event that the conflicting movement is not making good choices. And certainly there are a number of other countermeasures we have available to us to further highlight or enhance the conflict area. We've already shown you some advanced warning signs that you could potentially use. Having an advanced yield or stop line, particularly when you have multiple lanes approaching the crossing, so that you're improving visibility. If one car yields or stops, it's not blocking the view of the crossing for the other car in the adjacent lane. And then we could use some things like raised median islands, creating a two-stage crossing, or having a raised crossing altogether where it's a speed table, essentially, so that motor cars are further encouraged to slow down. And then finally, you could enhance the crossing with something like a rectangular rapid flashing beacon or a pedestrian hybrid beacon. Greg, you had some thoughts about those.
Sure, yeah. The rectangular rapid flashing beacon versus the pedestrian hybrid beacon, they're definitely two different levels of control there. The flashing beacons are really advisory. They are to catch the motorist's attention, whereas the hybrid beacons are there to stop the motorist and to allow free movement of the cyclists and pedestrians. I just wanted to note that to install the pedestrian hybrid beacons, there are traffic signal warrants that have to be met. Those are based on both the speed of the roadway, the volume, the design hourly volume on the roadway, and the crossing distance is a factor. If it's a shorter crossing, it's a lot easier to cross. It's harder to meet the warrant. Whereas if it's a long crossing, you're able to meet the warrant a little easier. There are some design guides or some tables and figures in the MUTCD that provide guidance on that. And then the last factor is how much use is the trail going to get. If it's not used heavily, then it's very hard to meet the warrant. And I've actually experienced that where we had to predict on a new trail what the usage would be to be able to meet the warrant, and it can be very difficult. There are tools out there to help you try to predict how much bike and pedestrian use you'll have on a trail if it's a new trail. If it's an existing trail, of course, you can do counts, but all those factors go into deciding whether you can put the pedestrian hybrid beacons.
So here's a photograph of a situation where some of those countermeasures have been employed. We've got some warning signs. We have a speed table or a raised crossing. They've created some median space, so you could essentially treat it as a two-stage crossing as well. So it becomes very visible for the motorists, and we've reduced the risk of that conflict area. Another thing that you can consider doing are adding some enhancements to your pedestrian hybrid beacon in the situations where you have met the warrants. In Tucson, they've done what they call bike hawks in a number of locations. In this particular location, it was a T intersection with a very quiet side street, where on the approach to the intersection on the side street, they made the bike lane a two-way bike lane approaching the crossing, and then you have the pedestrians crossing from the sidewalk. And some of the things that they added were some buttons that were within reach of the bicyclist and some additional signs and messages to communicate to the bicyclists that it's their turn or it's their opportunity to cross. And so the message sign said bikes wait or bikes okay. There are other variations that could also be employed, and we have people on our MUTCD team who have some really good thoughts and ideas on what the best approaches are. So if someone wants to try something innovative along these lines, we do have resources that can provide more information. So moving on from shared use path crossings, we're going to start talking about some of the more typical intersections and the treatments that we can use there. First off, just thinking about the conflict points, bicyclists experience the same number of conflict points that both motorists and pedestrians have, as well as they have a conflict with the right turn movement, and they have a conflict when they're trying to make a left turn. This illustrates where that right turn conflict occurs. We approach it in different ways depending on how many lanes there are at the intersection. If you have an auxiliary turn lane, then there's that weaving maneuver or crossing maneuver where the bike lane has to get to the left of the right turn lane. If you don't have that right turn lane, then the conflict is occurring up at the crosswalk or the stop bar, where the bicyclist can be at risk of a right hook type crash where the motor vehicle turns in front of them or into them. And then here we have a photograph illustrating that left turn conflict where the bike lane approaching the intersection was on the right, and the bicyclist would have to cross the travel lane over to the left turn lane to get through the intersection and make that left turn maneuver. So some of the countermeasures that we're looking at are specifically to address those turning conflicts. Something to think about is, depending on what type of bike facility you have approaching the intersection, is going to influence what countermeasures may be appropriate. Certainly in rural areas, you may be using the shoulder for your bike lane, but the shoulder is technically not a travel lane, and it certainly could create some confusion once you get to the intersection. So we need to think about modifying the shoulder striping or switching to some other type of bikeway through the intersection. So this is another illustration from the rural road networks, where we're seeing the typical striping that usually happens with shoulders at intersections. And if you imagine being that bicyclist on the approach, you're suddenly squeezed out or forced into the travel lane without any clear communication about where or what you should do. A very simple modification to that would be to create a break in the shoulder striping where it jumps from the 10-foot or 6-foot shoulder that you may have to the edge line that wraps around the corner. And you can further enhance that with having some dashed lines towards the end of that continuation of the shoulder line, and even take them all the way through the intersection to further highlight that zone of conflict for the motorists. Another option would be to put some shared lane markings at the intersection. This certainly isn't a rural intersection, but at any type of intersection, if you don't have a bikeway on the approach, maybe you do want to add some shared lane markings, at least at the intersection, to clarify where the through movements and turning movements are for the bicyclist as well as the motor vehicle. And you can just add a bike lane at the intersection and let it end beyond the intersection. And this is an example of that, where they provided some extra guidance to get all the way through the intersection. This is another example of some outdated pavement markings. We certainly don't use the diamonds anymore. But something they could have done to further enhance it is highlight that point of conflict where the right turners will be crossing the bike lane to approach the intersection. In some cases, you may not have any sort of right turn lane, but you can at least carry the bike lane striping through the intersection, dash it across the intersection, and provide some enhanced signing to highlight that it is a zone of conflict and that you want motor vehicles to yield. And we have a whole suite of options available to us for striping those conflict zones. And you notice in each of these cases we do have dashed lines, but they don't have to be the standard width. You can make them wider to create more emphasis or enhance them further by adding a SHARROW or green pavement. And there's a number of ways that you can use that green pavement. Greg, would you like to talk about some of the options with green pavement?
Yeah, certainly. These three images are great because they do show different ways of accomplishing the same thing, and I think the intent is to, for all of them, is to accentuate where that crossing zone is. The one on the bottom is one of my personal favorites. I think it's fairly practical and is self-explanatory to both the cyclists and the motorists. We recently proposed that, however, on a project, and the city basically said, well, we can install it, but we're not going to restripe it that way. We'll never get our crews to do the green between the white so neatly like that. So I think I just want to point out that you need to think about long-term maintenance and the reality of whether it would be maintained the way you envisioned it. And those green and white stripes happen to also be in the area where the vehicles will be crossing and wearing out the paint the most. So I might go with the second option down as the most likely to be maintained for where the crossing zone is.
And for that second option, while you might have green right at the intersection, you don't necessarily have to continue the green all the way between the intersections.
Correct.
Yeah. And having green all the way along the bikeway may be more maintenance that you want to take on, but certainly at those conflict places, it's a good choice.
Yep.
The other thought I had is, these are all showing the approach to the intersection, but I really like using enhanced markings or green markings at the receiving end of the intersection where vehicles are turning into lanes to help line them up and so they're not encroaching onto the bikeway on the far side of the intersection. Sometimes you'll have the scenario where the right lane becomes a must-turn only lane or a drop lane. In this scenario, we have some dashed lines that indicate that there is a conflict coming, but we don't have dashed lines that carry across the travel lane because we don't want to indicate to the bicyclists that they have the priority or the right-of-way. We want them to be cautious and watchful as they cross the travel lane. So the striping you see here would be the correct application in this situation. But you can further highlight the conflict zone if you do have a particular concern. In this area, you could add something like a SHARROW to highlight that there is bicycle traffic crossing. You just don't want to indicate that the bicyclist has the right-of-way. And if you wanted to enhance that SHARROW even further, one of the experimental options we have available is placing a box of green pavement underneath the SHARROW marking. And then we may have scenarios where we don't have enough width through the intersection to provide that keyway and the auxiliary lanes that we may wish to have at the intersection. And so here's an example where they have a separated bike lane on the approach, but they've turned it into a shared lane marking. And in this case, the bicyclist can get ahead of the motor car or behind the motor car, taking the lane, established in a location where they're very visible. And we want to further indicate to them that they do have the option to go straight through the intersection rather than being a right turn only lane for them. We do this type of signing for buses very often. We can also do this for bicyclists. Now, when we start talking about addressing left turn conflicts, it becomes a little bit more complicated. What you see here is what we call a two-stage left turn box, where the bicyclist on the left side of the screen would be traveling with the green light partway across the intersection, and then they would stop and wait in that green box for the light to change, and then they can proceed towards the top of the image to make their left turn maneuver. Some of the things that you need to do when you have this two-stage turn box is definitely want to have a bike symbol with the green marking in the box identifying it, including that turn arrow. You also want to have a right turn on red prohibition so that the cars that are queued behind the turn box aren't encroaching into their space. And you'll absolutely need to have some form of passive detection because the bicyclist won't be able to reach any push buttons. So you'll need to have loops or video detection or something similar that will pick up the bicyclists who are waiting in that box for the maneuver. And absolutely, you want to consider the volume of bicyclists that you have, the space you have in the intersection, and sizing the box appropriately so that you don't have the bicycle sitting in an active travel lane. This is an image of what we call a bike box. And I will say that very often the two-stage turn boxes get called bike boxes because they're square, but there is a difference based on the terminology. In this case, when the light turns red, the bicyclist can proceed to the front of the queue at the intersection. And if they happen to be turning left, they can even move over in front of the vehicle so that they're positioned up front, they get a head start through the intersection, they get the full green time to cross that intersection. Greg, you had some comments about what happens with that green time, though.
Sure, yeah. It really is all about timing. There's a concern that cyclists could be overtaking the cars as the cars get the green, and that motorist may be taking a right. The motorist won't see the bike coming up on the right side faster than them, particularly if it's a downhill stretch. You know, the cyclist is more likely to be overtaking the car as they get the green. And the cyclist also has to be aware that, you know, they may start to get over into that bike box right as the vehicle is getting the green and starting to go. So it is all about timing. And I wanted to mention too that these are not, you know, widespread yet in general, and there's definitely an educational need, both for the motor vehicles and the cyclists, and you know, getting that out into the community before you paint them is a really good thing, using social media, newspaper, whatever, but to make sure everybody understands what they are. And one of my personal thoughts is too that don't do it in just one or two locations. If you can do it for an entire corridor, or if you can do it for a group of city blocks, that's a lot better because people become accustomed on how to use them as opposed to just one or two here and there. So just a few thoughts, a few cautions.
Well, and that would apply certainly to bike boxes as well as the turn boxes.
Definitely a turn box too, which is, you know, maybe confusing to some people. So I think the educational piece there is really important.
I'd like to cut in with in here. Sorry to interrupt. We got some questions here about specifically what sort of criteria agencies should use to determine when they need to move to a bike box. Like, what are you looking for? Are there any sort of thresholds or parameters that would kind of push you to that decision?
Well, one thing I would say is certainly if you have a whole line of bicyclists who are stopped in the bike lane on the approach to the intersection, and you're having a hard time clearing those bicyclists through the intersection during the green time because they're sitting, you know, 50 feet back behind all the other bicyclists in front of them, that would be one of those triggers to be thinking about something like that. Greg, what would you add to that?
I think in addition, how many of them are left turners at a location where you want to give them the ability to get out there in front and make that left. You know, if you're able to tell, you know, what type of bike counts you have, how many are turners.
Okay.
So some of the things that you need to have as part of your bike box, or some of the advantages, we've increased the visibility of the bicyclist. We've reduced signal delay because they get that full green time. They're positioned for that left turn. We're preventing that right hook except the very beginning of that green time. And certainly it groups the bicyclists up together at the front of the intersection. And the elements that we have are that advanced stop bar, the bike symbol, the green pavement. Right turn on red here again is prohibited. The bike box is set back from the crosswalk, so you don't have bicyclists parked in the way of pedestrians. And then also having a pedestrian countdown signal is helpful in terms of cueing the bicyclists on whether there's enough time left in the signal for them to move over into the left portion of the box, or if they just want to wait where they are on the right side. And then we also need to be thinking about signal timing in general for any intersections where we're accommodating bikes. But in particular here, we want to think about the appropriate yellow change and red clearance intervals for bicyclists traveling through the intersection. In terms of signal timing in general, we need to be thinking about the fact that bikes start up and travel slower than cars do. And so it can be helpful if we differentiate in our detection between the bikes and the motor cars so that we can optimize the signal operations to best accommodate who's there queued and waiting to cross the intersection. We can further enhance it by giving a leading bike interval. If we have some specific bike signals, we can give bicyclists a head start so that they're positioned in their bike lane across the intersection in a visible place before the motor cars are given the chance to go. And then finally, if we really want to remove the risk of crashes and conflicts, we can fully segregate those conflicting movements with the signal, only giving a green to a bicyclist when there's no opportunity of a car to hit them, and only giving the cars a green when there's no opportunity for them to hit a bike. So for that application, certainly having a bike signal face is helpful. A lot clearer to have something that has that symbol so you know it's meant for the bikes. You can use a normal signal head, but then you have to have the supplemental signing to indicate that it is a bike signal. Some other applications for that bike signal face is to deal with the contraflow situations where maybe you have a bike lane on the left side of the roadway and you don't want to confuse motorists with a signal that's positioned for the bicyclists. And then finally, if you're having a lot of violations by bicyclists proceeding through the intersection, maybe you want to add some bike signal faces just to say, yes, we really do mean you. It does apply to you. Greg, do you have any more thoughts on bike signals?
No, I don't have a lot of experience with them, but I think you just hit on some good ones there.
But I do know you've had some experience with bike detection. I'll ask you to comment on this. Certainly we have the range. We can go from the basic buttons, and then we have loops, video detection, microwave, radar, and infrared. First off, buttons, if this is what we're relying on for bicyclists, we should, at a very minimum, at least position a button so that a bicyclist can reach it from the street and doesn't have to dismount and get on the sidewalk. With loops, there are varying degrees of usefulness in terms of positioning of the bike on the loop. And the bicyclist needs to know where that optimal positioning is. So we supplement that with some pavement markings. But the challenge is lots of bicyclists don't necessarily know what this means. So this is part of that education issue that we need to consider. That pavement marking may also be important on the other passive types of detection, particularly on a shared lane type scenario where the bicyclist has the full width of the lane to position themselves and they may not be in the best spot to be picked up. So maybe even in those scenarios you would want to consider having that marking. And then, we have the whole range of passive detection available to us, and a lot of it has to do with how sensitive the system is set up to be, and can it pick up the difference between a bicyclist and a car? Greg, what's been your experience?
Yeah, sure. I do want to go back to the inductive loops for 1 second. One very common complaint that we hear is from bicyclists who do position themselves correctly and are not detected. And that's a common occurrence where the public works crews or whoever are maintaining the signals may not have the sensitivity dialed in just right to pick up bikes. They will frequently not have it be very sensitive so that they don't get stray triggers, you know, by cars that are nearby. They want it. They tend to dial it so it's rough, not sensitive, so that often a cyclist won't get picked up. And what happens in those cases, or what should happen, is the cyclist should report it so that they can go out there and adjust it to where it will work. So then next slide. So yeah, detection, you know, there's different methods, and we just had this discussion in the office the other day. One of the ones that's very interesting is thermal detection, where they're picking up body heat essentially, and you can, it's a type of video detection, I guess, passive detection. But what's nice about it is you can actually do bike counts, and your controller should be able to you know, record how many bikes are going through an intersection, and that could be very useful information for you for a number of reasons. So there's video, there's radar, there's thermal imaging, all do very much the same thing.
So with that, we're going to move on to one of our non-traditional intersection forms, or maybe we're reverting back to a traditional intersection form with a few enhancements. But how do we handle bicyclists at roundabouts? We do not take bike lanes through roundabouts. Greg, would you like to comment on why that is?
Yeah, one of the primary reasons is what you're trying to do at a roundabout is have motor vehicles reduce speed. And to do that, you really need to reduce the pavement width at the entrance to the roundabout. So having that bike lane there is just providing the motorists too much width. It gives them too much room to go through the roundabout at a higher speed. The other thing is the motorist entering the roundabout is looking to his left. So if you're on his right in a bike lane that's coming into the roundabout, you're not visible really, because he's looking to the left to see the circulating vehicles. So a few different reasons there, but the lanes are not carried into the roundabout.
So you know, the advantages that we have at the roundabouts is you have those slow speeds because of that deflection angle and the truck apron around the median island, and then you know, those narrower lanes as well. And then as long as we're keeping the roundabout simple, it's reducing the number of conflict points for the bicyclist as well as other motorists, providing better safety overall. We've reduced speed, removed conflict points, which are great benefits in intersection design. And that splitter island simplifies some of the movements happening. But we do want to make sure that for bicyclists who may not be comfortable taking the lane around the roundabout, that we are providing an escape ramp. So here's a bicyclist that is approaching the roundabout, and you'll see here that the bike lane has ended before that approach, and the bicyclist is entering the travel lane. Here the bicyclist is circulating around the roundabout. It's a slow speed, there's fewer conflicts, and so it should be a much more comfortable movement than it would be in other situations. The bicyclist continues around until they reach their exit, and then the bike lane begins again, giving them an opportunity to get out of the motor vehicle lane. And here we have a bicyclist who chose not to drive in the travel lane, but they have that option of an escape ramp where they can ride up onto the sidewalk and behave like a pedestrian riding their bike around the roundabout. One thing I would mention in terms of sidewalk width is if you've just been accommodating pedestrians on the approach to the roundabout, you may want to consider having a wider sidewalk because you're now essentially creating a shared use path around the intersection area. final topic for today's discussion, we're going to mention some features of protected intersections. And if you recall from our last webinar, we've termed separated bike lanes as such because we wanted to avoid the word protected. We don't really have enough of these around that we've come up with any different terminology. Protected intersection seems to be the terminology that sticks. But the way this protected intersection works is you carry the separated bike lane up to and essentially through the intersection by adding extra features at the intersection and providing some enhanced markings through the conflict points. One of the benefits of the protected intersection is improving the visibility of the bicyclists as they're approaching and crossing the side street. These first two images, we've got a plan view showing the sight cone for the driver in the motor vehicle, and to the right of that there's an image where you sort of get the driver's viewpoint of what their view might be, and you can see that the bicyclist is not showing up in that cone of vision, but the bicyclist is there and at risk of being hit with that right hook type crash. In this scenario, we've got a separated bike lane that is proceeding through the intersection, and this sort of demonstrates the same thing we were talking about with shared use path crossings of side streets. In this case, it's not a protected intersection, but just being positioned further away from the turning motor vehicle puts the bicyclist in that sight line and gives a better opportunity for someone to yield or slow down or stop as appropriate. And here you can see some examples of situations where we have that right turn conflict. And on the left, we have a protected intersection where the motorist is positioned well to see the bicyclist crossing. On the right, we have a conventional bike lane where that bicyclist is right in that blind spot. So some of the key features of a protected intersection. First of all, we have this corner refuge island that separates fully the traffic from the pedestrians and bicyclists at that corner, providing some positive control. Then we have the forward queuing area, a place where the bicyclists can cross the perpendicular bikeway and perpendicular pedestrian crossing and get to a spot where they can wait for their time to cross the intersection. We have some space that we could refer to as the motorist yield zone. If there's enough space there for the motor vehicle to pause, if they're turning, other motor vehicles behind them can proceed through the intersection where the turning car can pause and wait for the crossing to clear. We also have a pedestrian crossing island, which is much like the forward bicycle queuing area. Having this space would certainly shorten the crossing distance for pedestrians, which could influence the signal timing at the intersection depending on where you place your pedestrian buttons. And placing those pedestrian buttons needs to be considered carefully. Whether you're going to place it here or back on the sidewalk, and how that would influence your signal timing for getting pedestrians all the way across. And then we do have this space where pedestrians are crossing a bike lane, so we need to make sure that we're including all of those cues to highlight that this is a conflict point, that essentially pedestrians are crossing a travel lane. So providing some enhanced crosswalk markings, some yield markings, and also having detectable warnings in the right places. And with those detectable warnings, you also need to have curb ramps so that people can access all the way across the intersection using whatever mobility device they're using, or if they're using a shopping cart or dragging a suitcase, this is beneficial for all pedestrians. And this is an example we have from Chicago, Illinois. In this case, they had from the top of the image, we have a buffered bike lane approaching the intersection. And off to the left, it looks like we have a separated bike lane where they have some vertical elements separating. And you notice that you don't necessarily have to have a continuous separated bike lane to use one of these treatments. They just transition from one type of bikeway to another on the approach to the intersection. And we have a good offset for the crossings for vehicles that are turning around the corner. We have some enhanced markings for the crossings, enhanced markings in the intersection or the bicyclist and pedestrian mixing areas. We have the corner refuge island, we have the pedestrian refuges, and we have the forward queuing area for the bicyclist. One thing I want to point out here, you notice on the top leg of that intersection, or the top portion of the image, there's nothing but paint on the approach to that intersection. This is an image of what it looks like after, or what it's looked like after implementation, where they found that it didn't necessarily work entirely as intended. And I wanted to applaud Chicago for trying something innovative, and also applaud them for paying attention to how it was working, recognizing it's not the end of the world if an innovative technique doesn't work perfectly, but sometimes finding some fixes to improve upon their experience. In this case, they didn't have these vertical reflective posts originally, and they had this turning yield sign on that island. And they found that sometimes the right turning vehicles approaching the intersections got a bit confused and took to the bike lane to proceed around the corner, or else got stuck on the curb in the process, which was certainly an unintended consequence. So they made some very simple fixes by adding in those vertical posts and changing out their sign, instead having a lane assignment sign to further clarify what motorists were supposed to do through the intersection. And so with any of these techniques, we're still learning a lot. We don't have an exhaustive library of implementations or lots of data telling us how best to use them. And so this is an opportunity for us to be creative, evaluate the situation, and check back to see if it's working as intended. Greg, would you like to add your thoughts to that?
Well, I just think in general, it's really important, A, to experiment and within the guidelines, and be daring like Chicago, but be ready to adapt and be ready to change things out. This is a classic example of that. I think these are brilliant. I think these intersections are really great.
So with that, I just want to remind you of a few thoughts from our very first webinar in this series. Why are we going to so much effort for bicyclists? Why do we go to the expense for what may be perceived as a recreational purpose? Well, a 1 to 5 mile trip is very typical for a casual rider. 50% of all the transportation trips in the US are less than 3 miles in length. So if we can capture those casual riders, which may be comprising the bulk of our population, most riders are not going to be the ones with the spandex and the $10,000 bike. They're going to be the ones with the low-cost bike, and they might be wearing jeans or work clothes as they ride their bike. But a lot of their trips may be very bikeable. Most of the bike facilities that we have constructed in the U.S. are at a higher level of traffic stress than is going to be comfortable for most bicyclists in the U.S. And so we have some opportunity to capture a lot more of our population by doing better and providing more comfortable bicycle facilities. With that, we have plenty of time for questions today.
Yeah, we sure do. And we got plenty of questions too. So let's look, I'm going to keep, if you're okay with it, I'd like to keep the screen with you so that if we can flip back and forth to different slides to use a visual element as we talk through the questions, we can do that.
Absolutely.
One question, and I think you covered some things about shared use path intersections toward the beginning of the material. There were a few questions that came in here and actually were submitted as part of the registration process. They got to this question of shared use paths that terminate into maybe urban environments, maybe suburban or rural environments, where they're coming into roads and possibly either coming in perpendicular to the road or kind of feeding into an existing road or intersection. Can you or Greg talk about what you want to think about with that? I've only seen a few. I think of a few examples of these. One in Seattle that comes to mind, but I'm sure there are a lot of them where the trail may just serve as a piece of the network and may not be just one long continuous trail. Any design principles in those types of areas that you can recommend?
Well, one thing that immediately comes back to mind is just making sure that you're very clear on what bicyclists are meant to do through that transition zone and highlighting any of those conflict points. I've got a number of examples of things where you might use a combination, particularly if the bikeway is meant to turn at some point and cross the roadway that it's been running parallel. You can apply some things like some left turn cue boxes that's maybe between the shared use path and the major roadway, so that bicyclists kind of have a spot to wait before they cross the street that's outside of the shared use path or the travel way, but also using some of those enhanced markings to indicate where the transition is occurring. I've seen that done in Puerto Rico, where through a transition area, they brought the bikeway up onto the sidewalk, had them cross sort of essentially an exit ramp from a busier street, and then proceed to a pathway that was between a frontage road and the major street. And in those transition areas, they provided signing and pavement markings to clearly identify the direction that the bikeway was supposed to go. Greg, do you have any suggestions to go along with that?
Sure, yeah. I guess it depends on how abrupt an end it is too. I would throw in use wayfinding as well in advance to let people know that the bike path is about to end. That gives them the option to jump off possibly at some other streets along the way and that sort of thing. So it's not just a dump you out into the boulevard kind of experience.
Yeah.
And then once they are there, additional wayfinding to say, all right, now you're in the city streets, here's how you get to downtown, here's how you get somewhere else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Both great points. Thanks for that. I think it sounds like there's a package of treatments available, and it's really going to be very context specific. But the key is to do something to make sure that that transition is smooth. And you're thinking about, Brooke, you keep talking about these level of traffic stress indicators for your various facilities, a separated path being something more accessible and comfortable for maybe a cyclist who's not used to riding in traffic. And you need to make sure that those transitions, if you're not making it go from a 3 to a 1 or the big drastic change, but you can kind of keep that and maintain that stress that you've or lack of stress that you've been able to establish. So very good point. There were a few questions that got to issues of and I'll try to package these together. One of the questions was, you talked about a cyclist having the ability to exit before a roundabout and ride around the roundabout possibly, or get off and out of the lane before the roundabout. There are plenty of examples of your separated facilities, separated bike paths and things. And the general question is, when those exist, by providing that extra treatment or that extra level of separation, are you afraid of sending a message to the motorist that that's where the bicyclist belongs, and if the cyclist wants to stay out of that and really take the lane and stay with traffic, are we making it conducive for both to happen, or are we sending the message that we really expect all the cyclists to be out of the way? This is more of probably a philosophical question than really a design question, but it's come up several times.
Well, I don't know how observant most motorists would be of that escape ramp, depending on how it's designed. And I'd also add, you want to be careful how you design it so you're not confusing blind pedestrians. They think there's a crossing there. We've had some mixed opinions on where you would put the detectable warning, or if you would put a detectable warning or not in some of these locations. But I'm not sure how observant a driver would be that that's there. But if it is something that we're concerned about, if we're in an area where culturally bicyclists are sort of considered the redheaded stepchildren, you could further enforce it by having SHARROWs on the approach to the intersection to indicate that, or even using some of those signings like bike may use full lane that we talked about in previous sessions.
Yep, I agree.
Okay, good. A few questions coming up. You mentioned in succession some of the options for mixing zones. at intersections, and then comparing those with maybe going to more of a full signal phase, a bicycle signal phase, and phasing that separately to protect those movements. Has any work been done to compare those two options in terms of safety and comfort? Probably safety. You can evaluate sort of having the mixing zone versus the protected, more protected phase of for bicycles. And I guess the question on the agency's mind is, what am I going to get out of going to that full signal, or can I accomplish some of the same benefit with the mixing zone?
You know, I don't know that we have anything we can look to that gives us sort of thresholds where your cost benefit, you know, safety improvement balances out. That's where we kind of have to use that engineering judgment, knowing what we know about signal operations, the effect on operations for all movements through the intersections, the volume of bikes compared to the volume of motor vehicles. You know, all those things are going to play into those choices, and certainly speed is another factor. And using your best judgment. I think for far too long we've underserved bicyclists at intersections. You know, one of the arguments against separated bike lanes has been it's tough to deal with them at intersections. Well, I would say any bike lane is tough to deal with at intersections. We just haven't been doing it well enough. There is research that I think is just starting out to develop some safety performance functions and crash modification factors for bikeways. In fact, the TRB bicycling or bike committee has gotten an enormous increase in proposals for research. So there's a lot of interest, and we're going to learn much more going forward. We just don't know a lot so far. Greg, do you have any rules of thumb when you're implementing projects that you use and making some of those choices?
It's so site specific. It's hard for me to answer that. You have to really understand everything that's going on at the intersection, the turning movements, the volumes, the speeds, how much width you have available. It just does seem intuitive that the bike signals would be more effective, but I guess the data needs to bear that out. And we were talking earlier that, you know, I'm a big fan of collecting data and trying to support some of these new techniques here that you know, once you've installed them, let's see how they're doing, and maybe we'll install more of them if we have good data. So
and that gets to the point of you talked about the benefit of the detection for bicyclists, the one form, and being able to count also, and you need good data, you need good counts and crash data and counts to really be able to make a determination about this. And I see. We talked a couple episodes ago about the role that some cities are playing now, where we're seeing such volume of bicyclists in some cities and such aggressive kind of rollout of projects that we're going to really see I think the research world advance quickly on some of these things and really be able to make better judgments about what the safety impacts are of different types of treatment. So we just need agencies to be willing to put themselves out there and experiment within the guidelines and do things like Chicago and New York and some other cities are doing. Just sort of a plug for research there.
I agree.
Well, and just a plug for data, I heard a great story just this week from CDOT in the Denver area, where they had early on collaborated with Kaiser Permanente to get some bicyclist counters out there. Some are permanent, some are temporary across the state. And one of the places they were looking at was a shared use path that follows along a major access controlled highway. And in terms of snow removal, the shared use path was low on the priority list, that all the roadways were considered more important. But the bicyclist coordinator was looking at the traffic counts, and they had 200 commuters a day using that corridor in wintertime, and was able to show that to the maintenance staff and say, hey, you have usage on this. You know, the preconceived notion was, oh, no one's going to use it in bad weather. Well, they had demonstrable information that said people are using it in unpleasant weather, so they increased the priority for getting those shared use paths cleared.
A few questions, jumping around a bit here, sorry, as things are coming in. Brooke, if you could navigate back to your slide on protected intersections. The questions come up, and as it always does, when you start talking about tighter curbs and tighter curb radii, the questions about truck traffic. And so if agencies are deciding or determining whether to put in a protected intersection, might truck turning movements be a criteria they look at to decide whether or not to use a protected intersection? If there are a lot of trucks turning, the tighter turn radius just doesn't seem, for a lot of our attendees, it seems like a bit of a stretch to make that work.
Well, and that's absolutely something that you're going to need to evaluate as part of the decision. One thing that you consider is, are you expecting the truck to turn into the rightmost lane on the receiving leg of the intersection, or can they turn into the leftmost lane and use that extra space to make that turning maneuver, or and does that give you some more forgiveness? The other thing you can do is make that channelizing island mountable or partially mountable, so that it's there and providing control for most of the traffic that's going through, but the larger vehicles that may come through on occasion can still navigate through the intersection. You'd want to be very thoughtful about where you're replacing your poles as well related to that, or your signs, so that you're not interfering with that traffic path. If you have a lot of buses that can't make the corner, then maybe some of their treatment's going to be more appropriate at an intersection like this. Did I miss anything there, Greg, or would you?
Yeah, you're right on. I mean, the good news is that that island is creating deflection, that the cars are going to be going slower than they normally would through a normal curve. The bad news is you're making it tight for trucks. So you definitely have to evaluate whether they can make it. And all it takes is one truck who can't, who's going to go over your island and wipe out your poles. So you do have to know, if it's going to work or not.
You mentioned earlier, you were talking about some trail crossings and other uncontrolled crossings, and the question came up, you presented the rapid flashing beacon, you presented the pedestrian hybrid beacon, a lot of questions about do we have anything available to us sort of maybe in between those two options, or something, if an RFB doesn't seem like it's going to cut it, but a PHB might be out of the question for whatever reason, the cost or other circumstances. Is there anything else that an agency can reach for to maybe increase yielding at these types of locations?
One thing that this image on the screen right now doesn't show is putting curb extensions to help shorten the crossing distance, maybe a little bit of traffic calming, anything physical you can do. If the concern is that the flashing beacon isn't catching their attention, well, maybe you need to make the road feel like there's more friction, that sort of thing.
Well, and a lot of these treatments, used in combination become much more effective than if they're just used alone. If you had a raised island in the center with another beacon in the center, that's certainly going to make it much more visible than if you had a 4-lane roadway with shoulders and the beacons are clear off to the side. So just amping up the design of your beacon can improve upon yielding behavior.
All right, great. We got our, as you were talking, we got our standard question about doing some of these things in northern climates where snow removal is an issue. I knew we were going to get that one, and I'm glad that, Greg, you're here because you work in snowy areas. And so the question, agencies up north, if they're thinking about protected intersections, and we got this question last time with separated bike lanes, how does maintenance and snow clearing factor into their decisions on whether to go full protected or keep things maybe just with paint and flush to the pavement? Yeah,
when I saw the image of Chicago, I said, oh, they probably get snow. So that made me think, well, maybe it's not that hard. But it definitely, when I saw all that channelizing, and I'm thinking of the crews trying to remove snow from in there, it would take a commitment on the part of the city involved, that they would need to spend a little extra time there to do that. I mean, it looks possible. It's just going to be a lot more arduous, I would say.
Well, you certainly want to think about what you're going to do with snow removal when you're designing this. It's not something that you want to just hand off to your maintenance crews and let them figure it out. In Montreal, they've been putting a lot of thought into this. Montreal has some all year round portions of their network, and prioritizing what parts of your network are going to be all year round is important, and making sure you can communicate that clearly to the public so they know what to expect and know where they can travel during storm events. And then there's a number of different ways you can treat the bikeways. I think probably the most effective might be some of the sweepers. It gives a nice, clear bikeway surface. When you're designing your bikeway, you want to make sure there's enough width for whatever vehicle you're using. In Salt Lake City, where they have some protected intersections and separated bikeways, they're using Kubota tractors that are selected for the size and have plow blades on the front of those. And something else in Montreal they've been experimenting is an attachment to their blade that it sort of creates a grooved snowpack in the bikeway. They're actually letting the snowpack with some sand dropped on it and letting that stay as part of their surface. I'd avoid things like salts and other treatments because, well, you think about how dirty your car gets. And bicycle, the dirt and the snow is bad enough, but you're adding something corrosive to that. It's going to get on the bike and the bicyclist. It's going to be less pleasant for them. So those are some of the things to be considering, but definitely thinking about the size of the snow removal vehicle. If you need a different vehicle or if you're going to need to do something different to treat that, and thinking about what your priority corridors are for keeping open for 4 seasons. But if Montreal and Minnesota can do it, I think in most situations we can figure something out.
I think you do also need to be aware of drainage and make sure you're providing adequate drainage within those confined areas so that when it does freeze, you're not creating hazardous areas.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing too is what happens with those vertical separating elements that you have on your separated bikeway. I think it's in Montreal where in some corridors they take those out at wintertime. But that also, the separation or the buffer space becomes their snow storage area too. So they still have separation, it's just a pile of snow instead of vertical reflectors.
Yeah, I think the bottom line sounds like one of the takeaways is that you do always hear the question about snow removal and that being a barrier to doing some of these things, and it comes in with raised median islands and other things too. But I think at this point we've got so many progressive cities that are doing these things in climates that do see a lot of snowfall. So I think maybe looking to them and seeing what they're doing, Montreal, Chicago, a few others, that they're kind of setting the bar for how to do this stuff. And so hopefully we have a lot of good examples that we're building up in our bank right now on that front. So there were a few questions that came back. Again, back to the roundabout-ish question. We're talking about either allowing bicyclists to get out and go around or to stay with the lane, and that we can keep those speeds low enough through the roundabout if they're designed correctly that we can make that a safe space. Any thought to using a SHARROW in the roundabout itself? Have you ever seen that, or is that recommended, and maybe why?
I've seen it, and I would say you can absolutely use it. And there again, it would be a case-by-case decision. Are people in the community understanding that bikes are allowed to use the lane, or are people throwing soda cans at the bicyclists as they drive by? That might be, it might be a cultural issue more than anything, but it's also really good in terms of positioning the bicyclist in the lane. Even though we're trying for narrower lanes, especially on the approach to a roundabout, sometimes that turning movement around the circulating part of the intersection can be wide, and we want to absolutely discourage passing. The one fatality of a bicyclist in the country was in a scenario where the bicyclist was passing a car. And I don't know if it was a 2-lane or a 1-lane roundabout, but and the bicyclist slipped and fell under the car. So, I don't know that there was necessarily anyone particularly at fault, unless it was a situation where the bicyclist was passing where they shouldn't. But we don't want them trying to pass in the same lane.
I think we need,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I think we need signs at the entrance to the roundabout that say roundabouts are fun, because they actually are. It's fun to ride in.
Yeah, and I think if you, like I said, you're designing them appropriately, your speed differential is going to go down quite a bit, so you're going to coexist pretty easily in the roundabout if you're doing it right. I question then, subsequent questions have come in about, well, we've seen examples of multi-lane roundabouts that are out there, and so does that change the equation, or does it change the conversation in terms of how we can safely get bikes through those?
I would say in most cases, I would encourage the bicyclist to the sidewalk for the multi-lane roundabouts. Yeah, there might be some, and certainly the more confident bicyclists may still take the lane. We don't want to tell them they can't take the lane, but I would say definitely make sure they've got a good escape ramp. Maybe even have some signing that encourages them to use the escape ramp rather than taking to the bike lane, because a lot of the motorists don't know how to use the multi-lane roundabouts. You'd hate to have them in a scenario where they're crossing and hitting a bicyclist in a situation where they should have been yielding.
Yeah, I agree. And during low volume periods, motorists can go through a 2-lane roundabout a lot faster when they don't have cars on either side of them. So I think a lot of cyclists will self-select themselves out of the roundabout. They'll take the escape route if they can.
Question came in, and this gets to an important issue. We shared earlier the link to the, and Brooke made reference to the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide that FHWA produced. I think that on the pedestrian and bicycle design stuff, and especially bike, we tend to gravitate more toward the urban examples, the dense urban cities where a lot of the cycling is taking place. But there are real needs, I think, in rural and small towns, rural settings where intersection treatments are maybe limited. The budgets are more limited, certainly. Right-of-way may be a concern. Can you all, we pointed to that guide, and that's certainly a reference. Can you all maybe identify some of the strategies we've talked about today? And Brooke, in the other modules you've mentioned that you really see as opportunities for even rural communities to begin implementing. It doesn't seem like bike boxes are really the way to go in sort of a lower volume corridor, but there could be high speeds, and that could be a concern. So can you speak a bit about options there?
I'd like to talk about my own small town as an example. We have US 40 that is essentially the main street through town, and it's a 2-lane highway, but very wide curb-to-curb distance where there's a lot of free-form angled parking that isn't clearly defined. So even for motorists, there are lots of opportunities for crashes because people are backing out, they can't see. And so I like to say, if I ruled the world, there's a number of things that I would do that would improve safety for everyone, but it would also improve safety for bicyclists, providing those context cues to indicate that this is a lower speed environment, trying to control some of the conflicts. So I would, and then certainly the intersections are very inconspicuous because we don't have curb returns, we don't have a lot of clearly defined sidewalks. So sometimes it's hard to tell that there's an intersection there. So enhanced crosswalk markings, maybe even having bulb outs at the intersections to account for that wide space from the edge of the road to the edge of the lane. And then maybe having some marked back-in angle parking, which is uncomfortable for people if they've never done it before, but it certainly positions you to have more visibility in the intersection. And some of those may or may not be bike specific, but anything that serves to reduce speed through Main Street is going to be useful. Some other things that you can do on the approaches to intersections is start marking a bike lane when you hit within that perimeter where you're more likely to get those casual users. On US 40, off in the farmland, I see the experienced and confident bicyclists, but as you get closer to town, that's where you're going to see the family bicyclist and maybe the local commuter who's getting from their home to a shop on Main Street. And so making sure we provide either shoulder space or a bike lane or even some SHARROWs in those locations. Greg, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would add just in a lot of little towns, maybe applying some complete streets principles, maybe road diets, maybe restriping lanes narrower than they used to be, that sort of thing. Look at your whole system. Are there ways maybe you can define bike routes so people aren't on some of those more hazardous roads, but find good alternatives around them? I guess that sort of approach.
Yeah, those two, and then one I think of is just that transition zone from coming into a small rural area, a rural town, maybe after a person has been driving through more countryside or remote area for a while, that ability to kind of narrow the road, to send that message, maybe gateway treatments or something to transition, get people prepared for a different sort of setting, and just that those cues that send the message to expect a different sort of road user to be around. So those are definitely some good options. I like that. I had a question I wanted to ask, and a few other people asked it too. I wanted to see if each of you, if you were able to kind of put a priority or set some priorities on what bicycle. We'll keep it to intersection treatments for now. What intersection treatments for bikes you see as really high priority for research to understand safety effectiveness, where you see opportunities to do that? What kind of treatments would you put on that list?
I think still the bike box and two-stage bike box. I think we still need more data on that. And in different scenarios, multi-lane roadways, urban, not urban, I think grade, no grade, things like that. I think the more we can learn, the better.
Well, I think the other thing I would add to that is coming up with some information on when it's just not safe to have those concurrent conflicting movements through the intersection. Because the way we treat it now, you've got that right turn green at the same time the bicyclist has the through movement green, and similarly with some of the weavings. But if we really want to be better at removing those conflicts, at what point do we need to give everybody their own specific green time?
Absolutely. We're getting a few questions that are coming in that are more related to our previous lesson on along the road. So I'm gonna jump to one of those right now. We talked a lot last time about SHARROWs, and I think that there's been I mentioned last week, I think that SHARROWs tend to get a bad name because they, I think, are used in a lot of inappropriate ways, but they can be useful in certain circumstances. And someone brings up a thing they see a lot, which is a SHARROW placement that seems to suggest that a cyclist and a motorist can ride sort of side by side on the road. So they're putting your SHARROW in the far right, and you're allowing that sort of wide lane to put the motorist on the left. Do you all maybe do you agree with me that that's one of the applications of a SHARROW that where it's sort of been misused in those cases, and that maybe how you can go about correcting a situation like that?
Well, I would agree with that. I'd also say that the other misapplication of SHARROWs is putting them on roads that are really too high speed for them to work well. When we expect bicyclists to mix with 40-mile-an-hour traffic, it's really not fair to anyone. And so being much more thoughtful about placement of SHARROws, not using them as a default when we can't do anything else. And sometimes we have to make some really tough decisions. Sometimes we have to say we're going to cause some pain to motorists during those peak hours because we're improving safety and mobility for bicyclists for 10 hours of the day as a result.
I totally agree with that. And I believe ITE has come out with some guidance on positioning the SHARROws, and it's based on lane width and all that, and it tends to be pretty far out in the road. It's not near the edge.
Well, and the other thing you want to be careful of is not placing the SHARROW too close to the parked cars, because then you're creating a risk for the bicyclist, the dooring. And oh, I had another thought, but I think I lost it. If I think of it later, I'll share it.
And I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a lot because the questions are coming in from different parts of the presentation. Brooke, can you find your slide where you show the 3 different options for striping the conflict zone with the green bike lane between the turn lane and the through lane? There you go. So the question came up for green lane delineation and conflict points. Is there a balance between the amount of green pigment and visibility? So it looks like, for example, in the top, you've got 100% coverage, but if you reduce that, obviously to the bottom, you're going to kind of divide some of your cost in half, but you might be making a sacrifice for visibility. Greg or Brooke, can you speak to maybe how an agency would go about making that decision? If their goal is to improve visibility of that treatment, but also, they don't want to necessarily think long-term about having to, like you said, restripe it every year in the same way with all that green pavement coloring. So how do you go about making a decision of which of these you might go with?
I think the first thing I think about is how you're going to install it. On the top image, you could probably do the green with one stencil and come along with your striping vehicle and stripe the white lanes on. With the bottom one, each one of those green dashes is probably going to be its own individual stencil. So the practicality of restriping is really going to be the big issue. Although I do like the bottom one the best.
Yeah, me
my
too.
own personal preference. I think it's really good for catching the attention because it both clearly illustrates the fact that it is a broken green line or broken green pavement, so it's the conflict zone. Whereas the top one with the continuous green, maybe that's not as explicitly clear, even though you have the white dashed lines.
Right, a motorist might be tentative in crossing that one on the top, whereas the one on the bottom, it appears much more like a shared space.
So, there again, this is one of those areas where we don't know if one is better than the other in terms of safety performance. And so if you have some experience yourself with this would be definitely information to share with MUTCD to further improve guidance for everyone.
Okay, great. I think, let me see, there was one more question that I was going to get to. I guess just wrapping up, this is our final episode here for the whole series. Obviously, Brooke, we went through and covered a lot of sort of fundamental design principles here. There's a lot more that agencies can get into, and so I just wonder, from your perspective, you're here representing FHWA and the Resource Center. Are there sort of go-to resources that you would recommend if people are kind of getting into this and new at it? What would you recommend they look to next as sort of a further reading? And Greg, same question to you, if you've got sort of your own standbys of good resources to check out for bike safety design.
Well, the first thing I'll mention is the AASHTO updated designing for bike guides is going to be coming out next year or sometime in the next year or so. And so watch for that, because I think that's going to roll in a lot of the things that we've been talking about in the latest information. But in the meantime, there's FHWA separated bike lane guide, Massachusetts DOT separated bike lane guide. They both have a lot of good information. The small town and rural roadway network, FHWA also has a guide called Achieving Multimodal Networks, and that becomes a really good reference pointing you to other things. And then a final comment, look at FHWA's websites, particularly the one I showed you today about the traffic control devices, as well as the Q&As for Chapter 9. And then Greg, do you have some other go-tos?
Actually, those are them, and the MUTCD, and see which interim approvals have been issued on treatments. I do caution people, you do a search on the internet, you're going to find a lot of stuff, and it's not all approved. So I really, want to make sure people are using the right techniques. Yeah,
great. And just to say, to follow up on that, you mentioned the need to experiment. There's processes in place where agencies can do this, and that shouldn't be a process that really scares people away. So if you've got an idea and you want to move forward with something, work through the right channels and do it. I think FHWA is very interested in seeing where things go and doing it, just making sure that the process is there and that they're getting good data back on how things work. So
yes,
we'll leave it there. And I just want to say thanks to all of you for sticking with us. We had a really nice long Q&A today, and I think we hit a lot of questions that were out there. I know we didn't get to all of them. If we can help you out with more answers, please do contact us, follow up with us. TBIC has all of our email addresses, and the archive page does have some contact information as well. I just want to remind everybody that as we close out, you're going to get an email today in about an hour, I think, with a link to the archive page for the webinar, as well as instructions for downloading your certificate of attendance. I wanted to let you know that a brief survey is going to appear when the webinar ends. We would really appreciate your feedback and your comments on today's presentation. I want to thank Brooke Struve and Greg Bakos both for leading us through this material and delivering today's presentations. And thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.